Hi everyone, my name is Jennifer Alchevy, and today I would like to discuss substance abuse in veterans. Veterans who served in the U.S. military can often face challenging experiences during and after their time in service. As a result of these stressors, some veterans use substances like drugs and alcohol as a way to cope. This unhealthy behavior can sometimes lead to abuse and then result in the need for substance abuse treatment. The purposes of this PowerPoint is to discuss some of the key terms that we have learned throughout this course so far and how these terms apply to veterans of the U.S. Armed Forces. So this midterm presentation will cover a number of terms which we will discuss in this presentation, including misuse, abuse, dependency, tolerance, cravings, and genetic links to drugs and alcohol dependency, symptoms of alcoholism and drug abuse, as well as family dynamics and treatment, and an overall general description regarding the recovery process in veterans. So before we get started on the terms described in the previous slide, I'd like to draw your attention to this particular image here. The Treatment Episode Data Set, also known as TEDS, is a database that incorporates the amount of substance abuse treatment admissions at mostly treatment facilities that are publicly funded, with the exception of admissions to Veterans Affairs facilities. So with this in mind, the veteran admissions in TEDS represents veterans who chose to seek substance abuse treatment in a non-VA facility. So in 2013, there were approximately 62,000 admissions of veterans into these treatment facilities. Among the substances shown in these pie charts, the most common substance of the abuse among veterans was actually alcohol at 65.4%. This was followed by heroin at 10.7% and cocaine at 6.2%. When we compare these data to the non-veteran counterpart, it is worth noting that the veterans were less likely to report marijuana, 5.5 versus 13.4%, or heroin at 10.7% versus 20.9% as a primary substance of abuse. This may be due in part to the removal of certain veterans' benefits if the veteran is found to have these certain substances in their system. If they are currently in service, they will have major legal consequences put on them. When looking at drug misuse versus drug misuse is when a prescription drug or drug is used for a purpose other than its intended purpose. Another way which misuse is defined is the consumption of illegal or illicit drugs or alcohol to the extent which an individual may experience psychological, legal, social, or even physical problems. Some of the examples provided by Summit Behavioral Health Clinic can include taking a Percocet, which is a fairly potent painkiller for a simple headache. The important determining factor is when people are taking a substance with the anticipation of feeling better, in spite of health experts' recommendations. In this context, misuse can occur if a service member or veteran is either taking too much, stopping a medication, as well as accepting prescription medications from a friend. An example which can involve misuse in veterans can include popping in extra Xanax with an anticipated stressful day or taking a large dose of Benadryl for a flight overseas. Drug abuse often follows drug misuse, although it is important to note that it is a separate entity unto itself. Most people, including veterans, consume these substances to feel high or to chase a euphoric feeling. Abusing powerful narcotic medication such as Oxycontin or Xanax can lead to inevitable negative consequences such as dependency, which we will discuss shortly. Drug abuse is a major health problem that affects many military and veteran families, as well as their communities. Each year, drug abuse causes millions of serious illnesses or injuries among Americans in general. Abused drugs can include, but certainly aren't limited to, meth, club drugs such as ecstasy or Molly, cocaine, heroin, inhalants, marijuana, as well as prescription drugs, including opioids. Drug abuse also plays a role in many major social problems such as drug driving, violence, stress and child abuse, among many others. Drug abuse can lead to crime, homelessness, and missed work, and even problems with maintaining employment. It also harms unborn babies and has the capacity of essentially destroying families. So, an example of the magnitude of abuse that can include the continuing trend of substance abuse in veterans. According to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, Approximately 1 in 14 veterans either have or had a substance abuse disorder in the past. Out of these 23 million services in the U.S., it is worth noting that out of the 62,000 veterans that have went into treatment for substance abuse, 1 in 4 of these veterans were homeless, and 65% of these vets were treated for alcohol abuse. According to the National Institute on Drug Abuse, dependency is in reference to the point which an individual can only function normally with the use of a certain substance or substances. With repeated uses of substances, dependency can occur. In a biological sense, when neurons in our brains adapt to the repeated drug exposure, it eventually requires the use of the substance to function normally. Once the drug is withdrawn from the body, there are a number of physiological reactions that can occur. These can be mild, such as for caffeine withdrawal, as it were, or even life-threatening, as we could see in alcohol withdrawals. Today, this reaction is known as the withdrawal syndrome. In more unfortunate addictions such as heroin, withdrawal can be very serious, which is often why the abuser will use the drug again simply to avoid the withdrawal symptoms from occurring. An example of this in veterans can include alcohol as a coping mechanism for post-traumatic stress. I personally have a number of my friends that have used alcohol to the point where they cannot function unless they have had several drinks throughout the day. Thankfully, all of them are still alive, but for most of them that have gotten out have been struggling with employment as well as financial obligations. Tolerance is essentially when an individual requires a higher dose to obtain the same effect as previously used. When drugs or alcohol are used repeatedly over time, there's a good chance that a tolerance may also develop. Essentially, it takes a higher dose for the substance in order to achieve the same response as it did previously used. It's important to note that the development of tolerance is not addiction itself, although many drugs that produce tolerance also have an addictive potential. Now, tolerance due to drugs can be produced by several different mechanisms, but nearly all of these methods affect at least some part of the neurological structure of our brains, especially certain receptors. An example of this can include prescription medications for injuries while in service. I'm friends with a lot of disabled veterans. By the way, I forgot to mention, I am a veteran. I was in the Navy for 8 years and I did 2 tours in Afghanistan, so I feel that I have personal experience in witnessing this. So many of my disabled former comrades have certain injuries that are difficult or otherwise completely inoperable. As a result, the dosage of their prescription pain medication have eventually increased more and more over time as the years go by, and many of them fear what will happen to them when they develop a tolerance for their current dosage. So I didn't really learn this until I was completing this midterm assignment, but apparently the term cravings is a little difficult to operationalize among researchers. But based on an article that I found on the power of craving in substance abuse, cravings is a term used to describe an urge to establish a less extreme state of desire. These researchers suggest that because cravings are a symptom that is difficult to quantify, it is worth considering cravings as a continuum of desire rather than a strict dimensional construct. One of the best examples I could think of that explains craving can include cigarette smoking in veterans. This particular habit is actually gaining a lot of momentum in the field of psychology, particularly because of the amount which smoking plays in current and former service members. Like many service members, I wasn't a smoker until I joined the military, and part of the reason was the camaraderie which developed among the smokers community. These cravings would especially kick in when we were traveling to our deployment site, and especially if these were long trips overseas. There were also certain circumstances where we weren't allowed to smoke in transit for training exercises, in which that made a lot of service members disgruntled. We always tried to stay away from the chiefs, especially when we knew that they were smokers. So when it comes to the genetic links of drug and alcohol dependency, there are numerous studies that have supported this concept. Prescott and Kedler argue that the correlation to genetic contribution and substance dependency is about 50-50. 50% can be contributed to a genetic disposition, and the other 50% is simply due to poor coping skills. So, one particular study looked at 231 people who were diagnosed with drug or alcohol addiction and compared them to 61 people who did not have an addiction. Then it looked at the first degree relatives, such as the parents, siblings, or children of those people. Their findings suggest that if a parent had a drug or alcohol addiction, the child had up to 8 times a greater chance of developing an addiction as well. This isn't to say that having a parent is or was an addict means that this is your destiny, but it does certainly mean that you may be more susceptible to developing an addiction to something rather than someone that didn't have an parent that was addicted. Perhaps this is an unorthodox example, but unfortunately, this was the only way that I could best describe this circumstance. If any of you have seen the show This Is Us, and if you haven't, I highly encourage you to do so. One of the lead characters that goes by the name of Jack, he's the deceased father that's in the show. Once we go back in time, we learn that not only does Jack struggle with an alcohol addiction, who is also a Vietnam veteran. We also learned that his son Kevin also has an alcohol addiction, as well as his father and his grandfather also struggled with alcohol. Let us keep in mind, of course, that this is based on a fictional show, but this is, in fact, a example that is actually rather common among families that struggle with substance. So it is important to be mindful of some of these symptoms that may suggest drug abuse. Although these aren't explicitly the criteria based on the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, these are still symptoms that may indicate that something is abnormal and certainly worth seeking attention. Although I will spare you some of the lecture of some of these symptoms, some of the biggest ones that I personally wanted to point it out would be developing a tolerance, for example, having trouble with completing normal daily activities, driving or operating heavy machinery under the influence, borrowing or stealing money to pay for drugs, hiding the drug use from people in your life, as well as sleeping too much or too little compared to how much you used to, as well as eating more or less than you used to. When it comes to alcohol abuse, you may have an alcohol use disorder if you, for example, drink more frequently or for longer periods than intended, have tried multiple attempts to cut back or stop and could not, desire alcohol so badly that it occupies your entire thought process, as well as developing a tolerance. With these symptoms in mind, it's in theory, if you've had 2 or 3 of these symptoms in the past year, that may be considered a mild alcohol use disorder. It may be a moderate disorder if you've had 4 or 5, and if you've had 6 or more, that may be considered severe and certainly worth seeking attention. It's also important to keep in mind that a serving size of alcohol can be 12 ounces of regular beer, 8 to 9 ounces of malt liquor, 5 ounces of wine, or 3 or 4 ounces of fortified wine, such as like sherry or port, 2 to 3 ounces of liqueur, as well as 1.5 ounces of brandy, cognac, or 80 proof distilled spirit. When it comes to the family dynamics and treatment, you may have actually heard the saying addiction is a family disease. And surprisingly, well, based on what I've learned from Alcoholics Anonymous from the big book, in many ways it is actually. Addiction impacts everyone who has a relationship with the addict, and in turn, this can disrupt the daily life of the family, and it can also negatively impact the stability of the family. When it comes to veterans in particular, parents, children, friends, and partners of addicts can often be swept up in the unintended consequences of the addiction. So, what's even more unfortunate is that, as I mentioned earlier, certain family patterns involving addiction tend to develop over time, and the children, sometimes even the grandchildren, can inadvertently develop addictive behavior and can create even more family tension. This can be seen in the example provided by This Is Us. It's important to note that because addiction affects the family of the addict so much, there are treatment options as well as support groups that are available for family members regardless of the age. Programs like Al Anon, Nar Anon, Codependence Anonymous and Adult Children of Narcotics are available for adult family members and friends of those suffering from addiction. Much like AA and many other anonymous groups, these groups are also based on the 12-step model. And this is designed to help people with self-discovery and to help build positive networks to overcome some of these struggles surrounding the addict. It is also worth bringing up that in the aftermath of the initial recovery process, it is clear that there still may be some residual conflict between the family members, the job which the addict is working at, as well as institutions which are important to them. In the concept of military and service veterans, this can especially be troubling, especially if there are legal consequences to the addiction. Based on what I have learned from the Big Book, it is imperative that family members are mindful that the individual is currently trying to undergo their own process of recovery, and while it may not be completed overnight, they are trying to better themselves. So relishing on the past and expecting them to fail is not going to help them, but rather hinder their ability to obtain recovery. So speaking of recovery, recovery is a process of change through which people improve their health and wellness. Um, they live self-directive lives and strive to reach their full potential. Even people with severe and chronic substance use disorders can, with help, overcome their illnesses and learn to regain health and social functioning. This is called remission. So being in recovery is when those positive changes and values become part of the voluntary adoptive lifestyle. While many people in recovery believe that abstinence from all substance use is a main feature of a recovery lifestyle, others actually believe that handling negative feelings about substance use and living a contributive life are more important parts of their recovery. So there are several types of programs that are designed to help. For example, the recovery-oriented systems of care. So this program is designed to provide chronic care management model for those that are struggling from severe substance use disorders. This can also include longer-term outpatient care, recovery housing, as well as recovery coaching and management checkups. The Recovery Support Services, also known as RSS, are services that refer the collection of community services that these services can provide emotional and practical support for continued remission. A lot of the components can include mutual aid groups, especially the 12-step program, recovery coaching and housing, and as well as recovery management. This can include checkups and telephone case monitoring and recovery community centers. Last but not least, the social and recreational recovery infrastructure, as well as social media. These kinds of programs actually make it easier for people in recovery to enjoy the activities that do not require drugs or alcohol. Some of these can be recovery-specific cafes and clubhouses, as well as sports leagues and creative arts programs. Much of these programs can be provided through the Veterans Affairs, or known as the VA, and as well as active duty stations. When it comes to types of treatments, there are many available for service members and veterans. Much of these, depending on the type of substance abuse which one is seeking treatment for, some of these options can include, but definitely aren't limited to, behavioral treatment and counseling, which is aimed at changing drinking behavior, through counseling. They are led by health professionals and supported by empirically based studies that have shown to be beneficial. Medications are also available to help people with reducing and the amount of use, and as well as helping with withdrawal symptoms and preventing relapse. There are also medications that are helpful to people seeking treatment, while it is mostly noted that it is most beneficial to use a lot of medications in combination with therapy. There are apparently 3 medications that are currently approved in the United States to help people stop or reduce their amount of drinking and prevent relapse. It's called disulfiram, which alternates how your body breaks down alcohol. naltrexone by removing the pleasure aspects of the drunkenness, and camprostate, designed to ease withdrawal symptoms. I apologize, these are all new terms for me. They are prescribed by a primary care physician or other health professionals and may be used alone, although it is highly recommended to be used in combination with counseling to prevent relapse. There are also medical devices that are designed to help with withdrawal symptoms and also to help deliver skills training, such as a bridge. This is actually a new concept to me. This is a device that connects to your ear and is minimally invasive, that is designed to help you, I guess, not only not have as much withdrawal symptoms, but to also help prevent you from wanting to consume more of that substance. I couldn't find anything that stated that this was FDA approved, but it did state that it was FDA cleared. So I would take that with a grain of salt. There's also treatment for comorbid conditions, especially through behavioral treatment and counseling, especially if the addict is also suffering from depression, anxiety, or many other psychological disorders that may play a contributing factor to the substance abuse. And often that is a very highly effective method. I could take that from personal experience. As well as I mentioned earlier, there's also treatment for family members such as Al-Anon and Narconon, among many others that help family members that are struggling with substance abuse through one of the family members. Last but not least, I wanted to point out that there is a major social construct in terms of service members and veterans seeking mental health treatment. And part of the reason why is because there is a perception in the military that in which the individuals are considered weak if they have a substance abuse problem or a mental health problem or any other psychological issue which would make the individual either not a good leader or mission ready. And there's a specific reason, well, another reason why they are reluctant to seek treatment, and part of that reason is due to unintended repercussions for seeking treatment. An example of this can include certain security clearances. If if an individual is seeking a particular job, which involves a need for a certain secret clearance, if an investigation finds that the individual had sought treatment for mental health issues of any kind, they may deem them unfit to obtain this particular clearance, and therefore they may not qualify for that job. This can also include promotion opportunities if a certain higher ranking official is found to have sought treatment for, say, substance abuse, for example. This may prevent or hinder the service member's ability or veteran's ability to obtain certain leadership roles, to be promoted, as well as to obtain certain leadership opportunities compared to an individual that had not sought treatment in that part. While both the military and the veteran community is evolving in terms of focusing on mental health, we are not changing at a fast enough pace to consider mental health or seeking treatment for mental health as a positive thing. And that's really unfortunate, I think. Hopefully in time that will change. But in the meantime, to conclude on this presentation, we had discussed the key terms here: misuse, abuse, dependency, tolerance, cravings, genetic links to drug and alcohol dependency, as well as symptoms of alcohol and drug use. We also discussed the family dynamics in treatment, as well as recovery process and types of treatment available to service members and veterans. Here are my references. I'd like to thank you all for taking the time out of your day to watch my presentation. I hope you all enjoyed and found something informative. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to let me know.